Okay.
Yeah, if the speakers goes off, that's different. I'm just waiting for the cue. So that's a challenge, is to keep us all quiet during these presentations because we're on air.
Especially when people haven't seen each other in so long.
We are live. Good evening, and welcome to Winchester Academy's Winter-Spring 2022 series. I'm Kate Saunders, and I am a trustee with Winchester Academy. We give appreciation to the City of Waupaca, particularly to the IT and Community Media Director, Josh Werner, for providing the space and the technology to make this program available to you in multiple formats. Our next program is a special program we are co-sponsoring with the Waupaca Public Library and the School District of Waupaca. The speaker is Dr. Sanfilippo, and his topic is Community Building, a Culture of Yes. This program is being held on Thursday, April 7th at Waupaca High School Auditorium, starting at 6 p.m. We invite you all to attend. Our next regular Monday night program is in 2 weeks on April 11th, when Zhao Li presents Insect-Borne Diseases. So we invite you to come to that also. Winchester Academy's Roots of Jazz celebration will be held May 2nd through May 9th. Free tickets for the ticketed events are now available at the bookseller during their regular business hours. These tickets are to reserve a seat for yourself, as limited seating is available at these venues. We will have a question and answer session following the presentation tonight. Questions may be submitted via Facebook, the live site that we're producing this on tonight, or by telephone. The phone number is 715-942-9917. Again, that's 715-942-9917. Tonight's program is sponsored by St. Mary Magdalene Parish. Let's thank them for their support tonight. Our speaker tonight is Andrea Lemke-Rochon. Andrea is a member of the absentee Shawnee tribe and a descendant of the Menominee. She is also a member of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Wisconsin State Task Force. In this evening's talk, she will share a personal and historic perspective about this tragic epidemic that impacts Native families at an alarmingly high rate. She speaks in memory of her cousin, Elaine Tortolot, who was murdered on the Menominee Indian Reservation when Ray was just 18 years old. So let us welcome Andrea to speak tonight.
Thank you, Kate. I'm going to time myself so I don't go over. First of all, I would just like to say thanks to Kate, who invited me to speak. Kate was a wonderful mentor for me when I was just a teenager, and I used to babysit for their boys. So, and thanks to Winchester Academy for having me, and Anne for all the great coordination. I'm used to speaking at rallies and in more informal events, so I'm going to try to stay on time. But I'd like to begin, as we do all things in Native circles, just with a brief prayer. Creator, please guide my words that hearts and minds might be open to greater awareness, sensitivity, and compassion to the thousands of missing and murdered people in our land. To my ancestors, my elders, and all who are listening, please forgive me if I should make any mistakes. Have patience with me, even though my hair is gray. I am still learning. And to my cousin, Elaine, and to all of our relatives who have gone missing or been murdered, I wear red for you. I speak for you. Please know that you are not forgotten. So many of us do this work out of our love and respect for you and our deep desire to end these tragedies. So I'm going to take a moment to introduce myself in the Native way. People always want to know who your people are and where you come from, so we're going to start there. And I am Andrea Lemke-Rochon. I am the granddaughter of Marie Irving Quayler. She's Menominee. That's her on the right. And the little girl next to her is my mom. And this is my grandpa, Andrew Quayle. He is absentee Shawnee from Oklahoma, and that's his graduation picture from Carlisle Indian School. So we always want to honor our ancestors. And this, my grandmother, biological grandmother, died when my mom was young, and this is her stepmom, the grandma that I grew up with, Ada Aaron Quayle, who is Stockbridge, Muncie, and she was just a bundle of joy. And here is my mom with her baby sister. Her real name is Ori, but we all call her Babe, because as you'll see in my presentation, nicknames tend to stick. The person that I most want to talk with you about tonight is my cousin Ray Elaine. This is Ray Elaine with her dad, Bernard Turtlewat. My mom always called him Pumpkins, and his nickname on the reservation is Barnyard, so he goes by Barn, because, you know, those nicknames. So Bernard and my mom were first cousins, but when my mom's mom got sick, she spent a lot of time living with her Aunt Teresa and Uncle Bernard, his parents. And my mom always had a big soft spot for Pumpkin, and so consequently our family has a soft spot for him. Now Ray Elaine and I, we're just 9 months apart. She's 9 months younger than I am. Ray was named after my mom and her grandpa, and she lived on the Menominee Reservation. That's where my mom grew up. But my mom left and moved to the city because there was a big push, right, historically for natives to leave the reservation, get jobs in the city. My mom went to Milwaukee, met my dad, and then we were raised in my dad's hometown in Florence, Wisconsin. So I loved going to the reservation. I loved being able to spend time with Ray Elaine. Even though she was my younger cousin, I really idolized her and looked up to her. She was spunky and fun and adventurous in a way that I wasn't, so I always had a great time with her. She was willing to take chances and do crazy things, and we just had a great time together. The thing that I really admired and respected about Ray Elaine is she carried herself with a lot of grace and a lot of dignity. Even though she could be goofy and fun, she just had a presence about her that was really quite extraordinary and incredible. And so whenever I got the chance, I'd go spend time with her on the reservation. This is a particularly memorable day. Her dad had taken us all, he's a wonderful woodsman, very tied to the land there. And so he took Ray Elaine and I and one of her good friends all over that day. We went to all kinds of beautiful places. Ray and I thought we were pretty hot stuff. I was going into my freshman year of college. She was going into 8th grade. She's rocking her tube socks. I had really great Farrah Fawcett hair that day that we were both quite impressed with. And so that's a picture of us up on the reservation. And here we are with her cousin, with her friend, Poopsie Fish. I don't know, I think we were going for a Charlie's Angel pose or something. I have very few pictures of us growing up. My cousins gave this to me. But what happened is when I would go up to the reservation, sometimes her friends would kind of give me the side eye. And I asked what that was about, because I think I'm a pretty friendly sort. And Ray Elaine said, they don't think you're really an Indian because you grew up in a white man's city and you look white and you sound white. And I thought, huh. So she said, but we're going to change all that. I'm going to teach you. She said, I'm going to teach you to speak Menominee. I'm going to teach you to dance. I'll teach you as much as I can. So the lessons began. Ray Elaine would pound on my dining room table at home and try to teach me the fancy dance steps, and I was deplorable. But she was a gorgeous dancer. A fancy dancer, if you've been to a powwow, right, they're the women that wear the shawls. They're really light on their feet. She really looked like, it's to mimic a butterfly, and she really did look like a butterfly dancing on the earth when she danced. I was jealous of Ray, too, because growing up on the reservation, she was much more steeped in Menominee culture than I was. I feel like our family is really the product of the boarding school era. My grandfather started boarding school when he was little, and then he went out to Carlisle, Pennsylvania for his second boarding school. And then his third boarding school was Haskell, and he never really went back to Oklahoma. So my grandparents met at Haskell, and that's how my mom came to grow up on the reservation. In 1984, Ray Elaine was crowned the Menominee Princess. That's still something that they do every year. And you're chosen if you are a kind, respectful, good community member, if you're steeped in the culture, all of those wonderful things that Ray Elaine was, got her the honor of being Menominee Princess. My mom was so proud. She carried this picture around probably for the whole year of a picture of Ray Elaine, and anybody would listen. Look at my namesake. So it was an honor well deserved because Ray Elaine was really an incredible human being. In 1986, she became a mom. This is a picture of her and her boyfriend Bob and their daughter Elise. And the sad thing for me is this is the only picture that Elise has with both of her parents. When Elise was about 8 weeks old, Ray Elaine had gone out to the party of a good friend of hers on the reservation. And she was last seen leaving that party in a car with 2 men. And after that, she never came home. It didn't make any sense to us. She was excited about being a new mom. She was a really devoted daughter. She was supposed to be in a wedding the next day for a friend, stand up, and she didn't show up. So we were pretty devastated and didn't know what had happened. Now, I was away during that whole year. I traveled with a Catholic retreat team. I left in August, and I didn't really get home until the next year. And so I got a call from my mom, urgent message, call home right away. I called home, and my mom told me what was happening. And it didn't make any sense at all to me. We were 18. I just couldn't wrap my head around that she had just vanished. And I thought to myself, surely she's been kidnapped. Like nothing else made sense why she wouldn't have come home for her daughter. And so days turned to weeks, and I would call as often as I could and check in. We didn't have cell phones back then. And my mom let me know that people had been out looking for her. They had been searching for her. The police were involved. Her dad was doing his own investigation. And that happens a lot in Native communities when women go missing. Is a lot of the times the families are the search parties. The families are the one making the flyers, spreading the word, trying to figure out what had happened. So I thought to myself, Ray is smart, she's athletic, she's strong. If someone has stolen her, she'll figure out a way. She'll get home. And I held on to hope. And then we got to November, and there was still no word from Ray. She went missing on October 15th of 1986. And I'm going to share a news clip that her mom is actually interviewed in. So if any of my relatives on the reservation are watching this, it might be a little heart-wrenching. It's about 1.5 minutes, so if you don't want to watch. But this was a local media story that was done in November of 1986.
Life in this tidy Kashina home began to unravel nearly a month ago when 19-year-old Ray Elaine Turtellow simply disappeared. She was a popular student. 2 years ago, the Menominee Indian princess, and 2 months ago became a mother. Her family says they don't believe she'd leave all that behind.
Yeah, my gut feeling tells me that there's something wrong. I don't know what to think at this point. But that someone did something to her, someone picked her up. And those are the dead-end roads that I go down. And I can't afford to think of that too much.
Ray's boyfriend, now caring for their baby, is also stunned. He says there was no quarrel between them, no reason for Ray to leave him and their baby.
I don't know what to think at all.
This is the last place Ray Turtellow was seen, back on October 15th, the trailer of a friend, one of 2 parties Ray went to that night. Police say she left the party, then came back, and no one saw her leave the second time. The beginning of one of many dead ends for police.
I'm trying to pinpoint it right now. From what we got so far, she was taken by 2 individuals.
After a month of research and interviews and help from the FBI, tribal police hold little hope. Do you think you'll find her alive?
No. No.
I believe in my Creator that whatever comes of this, we're going to be able to deal with it. That's what keeps me going.
In Kashina, Monty Black, News Center 11.
So November became December, and then January and February and March. Every time I called home, there was no new news. So things got bleaker and bleaker, and yet I still held out some hope that just perhaps she'd find her way back to us. It was right before Easter in 1987, and I had been staying at a retreat house. And my mom called, and of course was sobbing, and told me that a trapper had found some partial human remains in the woods, and they thought it was Ray. And then it turned out that it was indeed Ray Elaine. And we knew then that she had been murdered and that she'd never be coming home. Her death had such a profound impact on me. I think one of the things that was especially hard is, in her case, she knew the people that she was with, last seen with. And nobody ever came forward to say what they knew about what might have happened. And we just have no answers. So I didn't realize, right? I was a young person. I just thought this was a strange fluke of a situation that happened by some people who weren't raised well, who didn't know how to be kind to people, like they were somehow screwed up and we were just victims. And our family, I thought, was unique. So it was really hard for me because we didn't have a lot of money and I couldn't fly home for her funeral. And I just always felt like, what could I ever possibly do to honor Ray Elaine or to try to make a difference for her family? And I've pretty much come up empty-handed, right? And I decided to become a social worker because I wanted to prevent any other family from going through what our family went through. I was smart enough to know that if young people get a good start in life, they have a much better chance of being happy, healthy, functional adults. And so I set my career in child welfare. I've worked in child protection for probably 28 years, and a few in Milwaukee, so I guess we're counting to 30. And I really believe that it's so important to help people heal when there have been tragedies that happen. So that's how I spent most of my energy. And it wasn't until 2017 that I first heard the acronym MMIW, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. And MMIP is Missing and Murdered Indigenous People. And sometimes you'll hear MMIWG2S, and that stands for also Girls in Two-Spirit. Two-Spirit would be gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender. And that population in a lot of tribes is very revered and seen as someone almost like a holy person because they can understand things from all perspectives. So sometimes you'll see that also. And I learned in 2017 some of these statistics that the National Crime Information Center had documented back then 5,712 cases of missing American Indian and Alaskan Native women and girls. However, the U.S. Department of Justice Missing Persons database contained just 116 reported cases. And I couldn't understand that. Then I've learned that Indigenous women are murdered at 10 times the rate of all other ethnicities. 10 times. And I didn't understand that either. And that murder is the third leading cause of death for Indigenous women. 84.3% of Indigenous women have experienced violence, and over 50% experienced sexual violence. And I thought to myself, I've got to figure out some way to try to make a difference. And I also knew that I needed to understand this better because suddenly here it is all these years later, and I realized, sadly, our family is not unique. This happens to Native families at an alarmingly high rate. So the picture here, the woman whose T-shirt you can see, that's actually Ray Elaine's mom. It's hard for her to come to these kinds of events, as you can imagine, and listen. But Elise was going to be speaking at a big rally down in Chicago, and so Josie came down. to start to listen to her. So, also in 2017, there's a woman there right over my shoulder, Renee Grelwitz. I had a friend, Jeannie Roberts, was the president of our local chapter of the League of Women Voters. And she said, hey, you've got to meet my friend, Renee Grelwitz. She's trying to get this bill passed for a missing and murdered Indigenous women's task force. And my ears perked up. And so I thought, maybe I can lobby for this bill. That's all I thought I would do, is lobby for the bill. So I try to go up to the reservation every August for the powwow, and it's the one time of year for sure I get to see my mom's family. And when I was there, I let my older cousins know and Ray's parents know that this was happening in the state, we hoped. So I asked permission to be able to share Ray's story so that I could be an advocate for this task force. And so this is a day that we went down to Madison, I think it was in February. There are women from the Women's Policy Institute in this picture. There are a number of grassroots movers and shakers on the reservation, the Menominee Reservation, that are also in this picture. People that work with victims of sexual assault and people that are working very hard also on this issue and trying to prevent these tragedies. So we went down and spoke to those ladies, and then we started lobbying. We went to every senator, assembly person that would hear us, and we were sharing our story and asking for a hearing so that we could get this bill pushed through. The reason we need this bill in the state of Wisconsin is because we know that there are multiple barriers to justice for Native people in general in the criminal justice system, but especially as it pertains to this issue, there are multiple jurisdictional complexities that impact tribes that don't necessarily impact other people. So, for example, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm going to do my best to explain this, but Wisconsin is a public law 280 state. That means that Congress made a decision back in 1953 when Congress was terminating tribes. They were trying to, strip tribes of their tribal status, and that did happen to the Menominee tribe in 53. They made this jurisdiction saying that the state, how does this work? The state was no longer, I should look at my notes, that the states were going to no longer be responsible for prosecuting crimes, or they could prosecute some crimes, and the tribe, if they had tribal court, could process some lesser crimes, but really major crimes were supposed to go to the FBI. So the Menominee Nation, eventually we, thanks to Ada Deer and Sylvia Wilbur and people that worked really hard to get our tribal status reinstated in the early 70s, Public Law 280 doesn't really impact the Menominee tribe. However, there are multiple jurisdictional issues. For example, when Ray went missing, you had the tribal police. Now, part of the jurisdictional issues there, well, I'll get to that in a second. So you had the tribal police involved, you had the county police involved, and because it was eventually deemed a murder, you had the FBI involved. So for families, when you have that many multiple jurisdictions involved, it's really very difficult to know who should we be talking to, who should we be getting our answers from. There's questions about who's the lead investigator, who's responsible for collecting evidence, who's responsible for really seeing that these cases come through and are brought to justice. And one of the really sad things that happens in a lot of tribes is a lot of tribal entities cannot prosecute major crimes. That has to go to the state or the FBI. And so tribes are really at the mercy. Is the state going to prosecute this? Is the FBI going to pay attention to this? And in a lot of tribal communities around our country, that doesn't happen. They don't get the same kinds of resources and help oftentimes from the legal system that other folks do. Law enforcement negligence and incapacity. Now, I just want to give a disclaimer. I am not against the police. They have a very hard job. Most of them are probably really fine officers. But what happens is, like anything in our country, If you have a big, robust budget, you're going to have really robustly trained police officers. And if you're in a little tiny police department that doesn't have good benefits and good training, you're going to start out and then you're going to move on. So what happens lots of times in these poorer communities is police, they get trained a little bit and then they move on. It's maddening to me that if you work for the state patrol, you get money put into the Wisconsin State Retirement, so you can start building for your retirement. But because tribes are considered sovereign nations, those officers don't get money put into Wisconsin State Retirement. And so there are all kinds of issues and complexities that creates a lot of turnover in organizations. And I'm sure this is happening not just right on reservations and with tribal police departments. And then some tribes have more finances and resources than others. So that's an issue. Gender violence by law enforcement. This is a slide that I actually took from the Sovereign Bodies Institute based on some studies that they had done. But one of the issues with gender violence is we hear this a lot. Advocates hear this a lot. When you try to report someone missing, they might say, oh, they probably just went out on a bender, probably be home in a day or two. So sometimes there just isn't the urgency to start making changes or start, investigations and start taking us all seriously. There's a whole issue with the difficulty in accessing data. Now, I am not a data head, but serving on the task force, I'm starting to understand how complex it is. Right? If a tribe wants to report data about their missing or murdered people, the tribe can't do it. They have to work with someone at the state who then has to enter it into the NCIS. So there are all kinds of issues. So that slide that I shared with you, those facts and figures from 2016, a lot of advocates actually think that those numbers are much higher, but the data isn't well collected or it's just kind of a mess. So, and then I do want to talk to you about policymaking process being abusive to survivors. We managed to get a hearing at the Joint Committee on Finance. They're the ones that had to decide if our bill was going to be pushed through. This was March 4th in 2020, right before the start of the pandemic. You'll see my cousins, Susan Waka and Annette Turtelot, and Ray's daughter, Elise Turtelot, and her auntie on her dad's side. And then an advocate on the reservation, Rachel Fernandez, who's also doing a Facebook Live tonight. So yay that we're getting some recognition. And then one of the women from the Policy Institute. We had gathered a lot of people to come down for this hearing. We had survivors of sexual abuse. We had women that had been sex trafficked. I was there, Elise, we testified about Ray's story. People were pouring their hearts out. Now, before we got to testify, there were a group of 4th and 5th graders there from a school that had worked with their state representative to get a bill on the docket to make the spring peeper the Wisconsin State Amphibian. So we knew we were going to go after those little kids because we don't want them hearing about sexual violence, right? And I was sitting back watching thinking, oh, this is great. I work with kids. I love kids. I believe in empowering kids. I thought they're learning how the government works and how to get a bill passed. And isn't this wonderful? And they testified. And that committee, if my memory serves me correctly, unanimously decided to pass this little law to make the spring peeper the Wisconsin State Amphibian. Now, I have nothing against the spring peeper. I'm a Native person. I get that all life is connected, right? Yay for the peeper. But we had women pouring their hearts out, and we had people on that committee sitting in those fancy big chairs up there. Some of them were getting up and leaving. And at the end of our testimony, our bill was not moving on. It wasn't going to become legislation. I was devastated. And I thought, how did we get to this place in society that we can elevate a frog on one day, but not elevate my relatives and the numbers of missing and murdered women that desperately need our help and attention and our government's help and attention. So, yes, policy making sometimes can be really difficult for Native folks trying to get things done. I do want to try to explain kind of, I'm not a historian and I'm not an expert in that way, but I do understand trauma and I do understand a thing or two about historical trauma. So I'd really like to help explain how I think we got to this place. I am taking some of these slides, not all of them, but some of them I'm using with permission from Chris Stark. Chris is a survivor and an advocate, and she works with women who have been sex trafficked. So she and some colleagues had done a report back in 2012, I think, called the Garden of Truth Study. And they interviewed, I can't remember if it's 112 or 105 women who were survivors of sex trafficking. Now, let me tell you, sex trafficking is not the only reason that leads to this problem, but it's a huge reason that leads to women going missing. So I'm using some of these slides with permission. So I want to take you way back to 1492 when Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? There was, what was happening in Europe at that time, we all probably know from our history classes, is that Spain was basically getting rid of anybody who wasn't Catholic Christian, right? And so Christopher Columbus, when he came here with his crew, brought with him a lot of the attitudes that were prevalent in Europe at the time. So I'm just going to read a few things from his diaries because I think it'll help understand maybe how we got here. From Christopher Columbus's journal. As soon as I arrived in the Indies, in the first island which I found, I took some of the natives by force, in order that they might learn and might give me information of whatever there is in these parts. And soon it was that they understood us and we them, either by speech or signs. They have been very serviceable. They willingly traded everything they owned. They were well built with good bodies and handsome features. They did not bear arms and do not know them. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want. So, from his crew member's diary. While I was on the boat, I captured a very beautiful Carib woman. Now, you remember he first hit the Caribbean when he got here. I captured a very beautiful Carib woman who the Lord Admiral, I'm assuming was Christopher Columbus, gave to me. When I had taken her to my cabin, she was naked, as was their custom. I was filled with desire to take my pleasure with her and attempted to satisfy my desire. She was unwilling and so treated me with her nails. I then took a long piece of rope and whipped her soundly, and she let forth incredible screams that you would not have believed your ears. Eventually, we came to such terms, I assure you, that you would have thought she had been brought up in a school for whores. And again, back to Christopher Columbus. His diary. 100 castellanos, which is a Spanish coin, are as easily obtained for a woman as for a farm, and it is very general, and there are plenty of dealers who go about looking for girls. Those from 9 to 10 years old are now in demand. So not only were they going after women, they were going after girls. You can read it all for yourself, folks. It's written somewhere. It doesn't get taught in our schools. And I have worked with social workers, I can tell you, who didn't even know about boarding schools or didn't even understand the plight of what's happened to Native Americans. And these are people educated in Wisconsin who go to our fine UW system who aren't even learning about this stuff unless they happen to take the right course in college. So I'll get off my soapbox now. And back to the European ethos at the time was all about manifest destiny, very different than how the Native tribes were living here on our land. And I do want to say, by the way, I was going to do this in the beginning, but we are on Menominee ancestral land, right? The Menominee people lived here for like 10,000 years until this area was ceded to the government in 1848, I think. So the Europeans viewed land and animals and children as property. They believed in the superiority of their own culture, and they really thought it was their right to explore and conquer land, as well as Native people and Native women, and especially to use Native women as sexual objects. The European attitudes toward European women. Women were viewed as property. A wife was a woman privately owned by one man. A prostitute was publicly owned by many men. Women were viewed as dirty and unclean. And the Europeans denigrated Indian men and Indian culture for holding women in high esteem and for honoring women as community leaders. European attitudes toward Native women. You got a taste of it in that one piece that I read for you. European men sold and traded Native women and girls for alcohol. European men took Native women as wives, fathered children with them, and then often left these Native families when the European women started to come to America. Native women were viewed and used as prostitutes. European men believed they were entitled to Native and African women. And sadly, this attitude continues to persist today, especially in prostitution and sex trafficking. While women were not viewed as being equal to men, Native women were viewed as less equal than European women. So, in Indian culture, it was much different than that. Women were viewed as sacred, and children were considered gifts from the Creator. Women were revered and seen as givers of life. Children were raised by the entire community and loved and cared for by everybody. And women in many tribes, they were the leaders. And in some tribes, even if the chief was the leader, it was the women that paid attention to the little boys and decided who would be the chief. So women had a lot of status in a lot of Native communities. This is from Philip Turner, 1792, Not for Sale. He notes that the European prostitution culture was imported, as was the culture of consumption. It wasn't about living peacefully with the land, right? It was take over and conquer the land. Prostitution was especially embedded in coastal urban areas, and then it spread to the Midwest and rural areas. So as towns and cities were, being built along the eastern seaboard, brothels went up, that whole culture that came over from Europe persisted and eventually came our way. And prostitution was focused on areas of commerce and the building of the infrastructure of the United States. So think waterways, shipping ports is a huge hub for prostitution, railroads, logging camps, mines, forts, trading posts. So prostitution came right along with it. In the 1800s, there were lots of red light districts, and it was legal in colonial America and very, very prevalent. Now, how did they keep all this prostitution going? Well, fees were paid to police, so there was kind of like this, well, I don't know if they would have said organized crime back then because it was legal, but to this day, police sometimes are paid off, hush money, so that these prostitution rings can continue. Police chiefs had higher incomes due to the pimp payoffs, often segregated geographically to certain parts of the city. Well, we already talked about that, right? That prostitution happens in these certain areas. Now, I'm going to focus for a moment on Duluth, Minnesota. Chris came to speak. Chris Stark, whose slide I'm using here, she came to speak to our task force. And I should probably tell you, I forgot that part of the story because I'm looking at lovely faces, and I forgot to look at my notes, but we eventually did get a task force. In all of our lobbying, we met with the Department of Justice, some fine folks from there, and Governor Evers was very empathic. So thanks to Attorney General Call, we did get a task force, and that's how that came about, even though we didn't get a bill passed. So I digress, but I forgot to say that. So I'm going to use Duluth because we're Midwesterners here, and that is a huge hub for prostitution. So I think it's important just to understand how the economy plays into this. So 1855, commercial maritime traffic began, and there were the first railroad in 1870. The ship canal was constructed in 1871, and by 1905, Duluth boasted the most millionaires because of, the export of timber and ore and grain and all those industries. So Canal Park Red Light District was established, and prostitution became deeply entrenched in that area. So Duluth Harbor today, we bring in a lot of money, which you can see from this slide, $250 million in annual economic impact through the Duluth Harbor. So there has been this long history of prostitution on ships in the Duluth port, and I can tell you that that is still going on today. Young, vulnerable girls will get lured by handsome dudes and say, hey, come on, we're going to have a party on the ship tonight. We'll feed you well. We'll give you alcohol. It'll be a good time. We'll play cards. So these kids are lured, or young women are lured, and then pretty soon they're trapped. Women are being trafficked and viewed as boat whores, still a term used today. And there are common misconceptions that it's the woman's fault or that women like it and women deserve what they get. Some of those attitudes are still very prevalent, and I can tell you, working as a social worker, I hear those things sometimes. Viewing Native women and girls as prostitutes continues and is reinforced by the shipping activity and culture. Now, there are a number of reservations not far from Duluth, so people get picked up and taken along to Duluth. Since 9/11, there were 3 sex traffickers that were caught, so maybe it's coming down a little bit, but it hasn't disappeared. And you have all these other industries that kind of feed into it, right? The reason things are so happening in the prostitution ring up in Duluth is that you've got the proximity to reservations. Sadly, poverty and homelessness will, desperate times, call for desperate measures. I can tell you that I worked with a woman that was sex trafficked. She was a runaway because she was being abused at home, and she made it down to Milwaukee. And I swear these pimps and these people can just sniff out the vulnerable people that are going to be easily coerced. And he promised her a hot meal and a safe place to stay. And he lured her in and promised that he would take care of her and nobody would ever abuse her again. And he got her hooked on drugs. And then he got her pregnant. And then he had to hide her away because she was only 15 years old when she was pregnant. And her life, he kept her hidden in a house, and she was running the strip district between Wisconsin and Minot, North Dakota. And so she stripped, and as soon as she got pregnant and couldn't dance after she got too pregnant, she got put away in a house by herself, and occasionally other women from strip clubs would come and stay with her. And he would bring her groceries, but she was completely isolated and ostracized. And because he beat her and threatened to kill her if she should ever leave, she stayed. And so a lot of these folks prey on people who are poor and homeless because they're much more easily coerced. So that's one of the issues with this prostituting. The other thing that we know that's true is throughout our history, right, there have been many efforts to break down Native culture. So for our Native women and girls, there are all kinds of issues that also prevail, sadly, in a lot of communities. There could be child sexual abuse, domestic violence, drug and alcohol abuse. Now, this is not to be disrespectful at all to any Native people, but, right, what do we know about trauma? Sometimes if we're having a bad day, if we're facing some difficult challenge, we're going to want to numb that out. We live in Wisconsin, for goodness sakes, right? One of the highest alcoholism rates in the nation, I think. You can correct me, right, if I'm wrong? Someone I used to work with, AODA counselor, is here. So right, we know, I don't think any young person grows up and says, geez, I think I want to be an alcoholic. I think I'll be a drug addict. Never happens that way. It's people trying to take care of their emotional pain that they end up resorting to drugs and to alcohol. Sometimes if the pain is too great in your life, you just want to escape from it. So these are some of the reasons why natives are targeted by predators and traffickers. When I was doing research for this talk, I found something written by a Catholic priest that said, and I don't remember quite the era, but I want to say it was like the 1930s or 40s. If you want to have sex with a native girl, just go to the reservation with a pack of buns. Crude, right? So, all of these things, taxi cabs, hotels, bars, brothels, all involved in this prostitution ring. Some ships' employees and captains also promote it. They're trying to take care of their guys, so hey, we'll get you some women. Historically, police were paid off by organized crime. There's gangs, there's street pimps, and it's interesting to note that the sexual assault reports in Duluth, Minnesota increase when the ships are in port. So I think there's a connection. So Duluth is part of this whole prostitution and sex trafficking hub that connects North and South Dakota, Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois, and Wisconsin. Girls and women are often recruited for man camps. So does anybody here know what a man camp is? Okay, nobody's raising their hands. One, okay.
I know, like in oil areas and things like that, is where men are living in a bunch of trailers and working long days.
Right, so what he said, in case you didn't hear that, is, and he knows that experience from oil camps, that men will live in trailers around the area where they're working. And that happens. You'll notice here on the slide before I advance, part of this Garden of Truth study, there was a 12-year-old Indigenous girl on Highway 94, had been recruited and was heading for a man camp at age 12. Can you imagine? Can you even imagine? I hadn't even kissed a boy at age 12, far from it. So these man camps, what they are is the companies will come in either for mining of minerals, mineral extraction, or fossil fuels, think pipeline. If they're going to start work in that area, they bring in trailers or prefabbed housing, and they set up little restaurants and bars, and they make a little town to take care of their crew while they're away from home working. So these man camps and these little cities just spring up. And these little cities develop, and then we also know that there are increased number of registered sex offenders in these areas. So if the Trans-Canada Keystone XL pipeline is approved, man camps will be located near reservations, as all of these, well, I don't know about all, but a lot of these pipelines are destined to go through reservations. So I've already talked a little bit about the poverty and the breakdown in culture and the strong family that has happened with Native people. There's a real desperation that people have, and believe me, I know women that have decided to strip to feed their babies. I've worked with a lot of strippers in child welfare because they don't have the education, they can't get jobs, and so they're loving moms who still want to take care of their children. So people will take great, great risks to survive. And I think it's interesting. These are some stats from the Sovereign Bodies Institute. I encourage you to check out their website. They do a lot of work to try to collect and understand the data, and are a great service to Native American women. But 1 in 5 missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls cases occurred in regions near where the KXL pipeline is proposed to be built. 1 in 5. It's pretty high. So What happens with sex trafficking, too, is you have this third-party control over the prostitution of people. So you've got the prostitutes, the pimps, and then these third-party people making money. And some girls are simply stolen away. We've already talked about the persuasion and how they're promised nice things. So part of this Garden of Truth study, where Chris and her colleagues interviewed all these survivors of sex trafficking and sexual violence, 86% of those women interviewed, this is around the Duluth area, they felt they really did not know what they were getting into when they began. So great deception and great trickeries involved. From that study, 79% of women interviewed had been sexually abused as children by an average of 4 perpetrators. More than 2/3 of the women had family members who had attended boarding school. Again, breakdown of the family. 46% had been in foster care. 52% were arrested as minors, an average of 8 times. So I can only imagine kids that maybe weren't being well supervised, right? Getting into some trouble. 92% had been raped before they ever got to prostitution. 48% had been used by more than 200 sex buyers, and 16% by more than 900 sex buyers. So I can tell you from my work, not my personal experience, but when a woman is raped, they feel like worthless. And if a child grows up being sexually abused, it just becomes part of their normal survival. So it's really an insidious, hard problem. And this doesn't just happen in Duluth, Minnesota. I've gone to some sex trafficking trainings, Packer games, huge moneymaker for the pimps and the prostitutes. It's unbelievable. So we have a culture that still is objectifying women, and that is a huge part of this problem. All right. Back to that study, 84% of those women had been physically assaulted in prostitution. 72% had traumatic brain injuries. And again, that's how the pimps keep you in their control, incredibly abusive environments. 98% were currently or previously homeless. 62% definitely saw a connection between prostitution and colonialization, and people felt devalued. 33% spoke of Native culture and spiritual practices and ceremony as an important part of who they are. So if it's important, but for years the government said you couldn't do it. I mean, it was really recently before Native Americans were able to legally celebrate our religious ceremonies. I wish I could remember the year, but it really, trust me folks, it wasn't that long ago. So the bottom line is racism has been a huge emotionally damaging element in the women's lives of the people that they interviewed, and it's a continued source of ongoing stress. Okay, this is another stunning statistic, I think. 52% of the women had PTSD, and if you look at the rate of PTSD in combat veterans, that's the same percentage. 80% had used outpatient AODA services, but they probably would have been more, had more benefit had they been able to go inpatient. So, right, when we look at this problem, we have to look at all of the systems that interface that. And I can tell you, trying to get a client in for AODA services, there are waiting lists, there aren't enough inpatient treatment programs, there aren't enough inpatient treatment programs that'll cater to children for women that are trying to get clean. 70% of the women had used homeless shelters, 65% had used domestic violence services, and 33% had used 33% had used sexual assault services. And 92% wanted out. They wanted to end and escape their life as a prostitute. So, because it's not all about the sex trade, I do want to talk to you a little bit about historical trauma. And this is where I really do know a thing or two. because I've worked with people who have been abused and neglected for my entire career. So, historical trauma is a multi-generational trauma experienced by a specific cultural, racial, or ethnic group. I'd encourage you to go on to the U.S. Department of Health, the Department of Administration for Children and Families. Where's my time at? I just want to read this to you quickly because I think it's really telling about what has happened to oppressed people in America. African American culture affects those communities as well. Historical trauma is related to major events that oppressed a particular group of people because of their status as oppressed, such as slavery, the Holocaust, forced migration, and the violent colonization of Native Americans. While many in such a group will experience no effects of the historical trauma, others may experience poor overall physical and behavioral health, including low self-esteem, depression, self-destructive behavior, marked propensity for violent or aggressive behavior, substance misuse and addiction, high rates of suicide and cardiovascular disease, acute problems of domestic violence or alcohol misuse that are not directly linked to historical trauma may also be exacerbated by living in a community with unaddressed grief and behavioral health needs. Parents' experience of trauma may disrupt typical parenting skills and contribute to behavior problems in children. Compounding this familial or intergenerational trauma, historical trauma often involves the additional challenge of a damaged cultural identity. So that is some pretty heavy stuff. And how has this impacted us? And I say us quite loosely. I always want to give the disclaimer that I did not grow up on the reservation. I look a lot like my dad. My life was very different than my cousins' lives. But what I do know to be true is that throughout history there was this forced removal of children from families. There was a loss of cultural connection, right? We have the Trail of Tears where the Cherokee were forced onto places that were not their traditional homelands. Native people have a very strong tie to the land. Our spirituality is very tied up in the land. So if you have to leave your sacred sites in the places where you were tied and grounded and felt like you could be a whole, healthy human being, you're going to struggle. And that happened in our history. We also have had the problem with foster care, and I am a foster care social worker, but we have had really high numbers of Native kids being placed into foster care. And if that wasn't enough, there was forced sterilization of Native women as recently as the 70s. Talk about that in a second. Here are the boarding schools in Wisconsin. Some of them, I can't promise this is an exhaustive list. This is from my friend Renee Grelwitz. Some boarding schools were better than others, and I always need to give the caveat that my grandfather did not report a lot of horrific things, but he was also a very kind, respectful man, and I never heard him say a bad word about anyone. So if it was bad, he maybe wasn't going to talk about it. But he also knew and was told that the world was changing, so you need to learn how to get along in this white man's world. But nonetheless, my family, we lost a lot of our connection to our traditional Menominee ways, or for him, absentee Shawnee ways. I first went to Oklahoma just a couple years ago and was able to participate in ceremony down there because when he went to boarding school, he just never went back. So this is really a stunner. I won't read the whole letter, but this is a letter from a Catholic priest, proof that in as late as 1952, you could buy a Native child for $10. I checked it out on Snopes. This is the real deal, folks. This priest sold a child to this person, Mr. and Mrs. Seeley, and the thing that really gets me as a child protection social worker is I'm not making an inquiry about you because it takes a good person to make an offer as you did. So we cannot place kids in foster homes without making sure that the homes are safe. But that was going on just 70 years ago. 70 years ago. This letter's dated 1952. Public and private agencies were also removing Native kids at a really high rate. 1/3 of all Indian children were placed in non-Indian homes by 1978. 1/3. 85% of all Indian children in foster care were in non-Indian homes. In Wisconsin, Indian children were approximately 1,600 times more likely to be removed from their homes than other non-Indian children. So, thankfully, the Indian Child Welfare Act of 1978 came about, and now as child welfare professionals, we cannot remove an Indian child from their home without talking to the tribe. The tribe gets to have legal representation in all the proceedings regarding that child, and there's an Indian child welfare worker assigned to look after the best interest of their homes. And we are now, thankfully, mandated by law to look for tribal homes for kids when they come into our jurisdiction, and I work in Outagamie County. So, and also, the good old Mormons got involved, the Church of Latter-day Saints. They had this belief that Indians were descendants of the Lamanites of Israel. I did not look up what a Lamanite of Israel was, but I'm guessing that the Mormons didn't think they were very worthy. So they had an Indian placement program that placed Indian children into Mormon homes, and that was not ended until 1996. Over 5,000 children were taken away from their homes and cultures and placed in Mormons' homes. So, as you can see, the government and different entities have constantly tried to chip away at our culture and our values. So, the effects of historical trauma that we know happen within Native families is a breakdown in our Native family values. There's incredible poverty. My mom grew up on the Menominee Reservation, and that is the poorest county, last I checked, in the state. We already talked about the reasons for alcohol and other substance abuse to try and escape all that pain. There's a high incidence of depression, anxiety, and suicidality. Child abuse and domestic and neglect and domestic violence happen. Some folks have post-traumatic stress disorder, and some feel a general loss of meaning and sense of hope. And there's internalized depression and self-hatred oftentimes. So, I will talk about the resilience too, because that's the hopeful part of the story. But I really want you to understand how historical trauma can play out for folks. We all have on our DNA these little end caps called telomeres. Has anybody ever heard of telomeres? Okay, right? And if you are under stress and your body is constantly filled with cortisol, that's going to impact those telomeres, right? They're like, did I say that? The little end cap on your shoelace, they protect your DNA. So when cortisol is constantly present in your body, as it is if you're suffering with anxiety or depression or you have PTSD, that starts to break down those telomeres, and then your DNA just starts to wither. And that's how you end up with disease and sickness and other problems. So what I have found fascinating in my work as a child protection social worker is that women that are under stress, their telomeres are shorter and less robust than women who are not under stress. In babies, if the mother is under stress, the baby is born with less robust and smaller telomeres. I learned it wrong. It's telomeres. So we know that stress doesn't just have a psychological, emotional, behavioral impact. We know that it actually affects our biology and our health. So again, there's some good news. There are things like mindfulness exercises and learning good wellness practices and taking really good care of yourself can start to repair some of that damage. So there's always good news. I want to talk just a moment about missing white woman syndrome. Do you know who this is? I put a picture up of a young woman. Anybody have any idea? Nobody? People are shaking their heads no. What about this woman? Do you know who this woman is? Anybody? Yes. Some people are nodding their heads. Okay. The top picture is of Caitlin Kelly, a Menominee woman who went missing in June of 2020. Her remains were found on the Menominee Reservation in March of 2021. She had some local media stories, like the one I played for you about Ray's family. She was in our local media a little bit. The picture on the bottom is Gabby Petito, and right, she went missing last year during the pandemic, and some of you recognized her picture. Gabby got national media attention. Every news outlet was talking about her. She was on the national news. She was on public radio. She was everywhere, all across social media. For weeks and months, you couldn't scroll on Facebook without seeing a picture of Gabby Petito. Now, I saw lots of pictures of Caitlin Kelly because of the work that I do on the task force and because I'm a Menominee descendant and because I know women that care and we're posting her pictures. But I can tell you that not one white person on my newsfeed posted a picture of Caitlin Kelly, but they all posted lots of pictures of Gabby. Now, Gabby clearly was a victim of domestic violence. She deserved all that media attention. She deserved the whole country coming together to try to find her and to try to find her boyfriend. But so did Caitlin, and so did Elaine, and so do all of the other people that are currently missing. We all deserve that kind of media attention too. And we don't get it. And that is one of the huge problems, is a lot of people don't even know this is a problem that's impacting our communities. They just don't know. So I am very grateful to all of you for being here tonight, because it's going to take raising greater awareness to help turn this tide that has been so destructive in our communities. Where am I at here? Okay, this slide real quickly. The FBI, this is a slide, if you can see it, it's broken down by race. The column in red is the media attention, and the column in orange are the FBI percentages. So I'm sorry I forgot to cite when this graph was developed, but it's fairly recent. So the FBI shows 35% of black women were missing at the time that this was looked at, but only 13% received media attention. Hispanics, something's wrong, because the poor Hispanic friends don't even have data available on the FBI site, but yet there was 18% of people in the media at that time, Hispanic, that were receiving attention. You'll notice at the bottom, white, there were 60% of white people were listed in the FBI database as missing, and 68% of those white folks were getting lots of media attention. You don't even see Native Americans, Indigenous people, tribal people on this graph, but there is an other column, so I guess we're in other, and there were 4% listed other in the missing person database, but only 2% of the others were getting media attention. So this is a huge problem that also contributes to things. I already spoke a little bit about the justice system, and for the sake of time, I'm not going to go too much into this, but there are a lot of paternalistic policies that denies Indigenous sovereignty to enforce laws and policies within their own reservations. So I think I talked about that before, right? Major crimes are often handled by the FBI. Minor crimes might be able to be handled by the tribal court, and some things might have to be involved by the state. So often we can't even prosecute crimes for our own people on our own lands. And in some cases we can. Some tribes do have tribal courts, but there are all these complex jurisdictional issues that make it kind of a nightmare. And I actually called a friend of mine on my way over here. I said, can you just tell me this again? Because I've been on this committee for almost a year and I just cannot keep it all in my head. And she said, I'm doing this advocacy work every day and I have a hard time weeding through all these legal jurisdictional issues. So sometimes the jurisdictional issues create problems, and cause confusion. And sometimes I wonder, is it a hot potato where who's going to pick it up, who's going to do the work? So we kind of get lost in there. 1 in 5 missing and murdered Indigenous women who are killed due to domestic violence are never classified as homicides. So that's why we worked so hard to get a task force. And these are some of the things that we are trying to do on the task force. Number one, we're focusing on examining these factors that contribute to MMIW and the response from social service agencies. So we're not just looking at the laws, and we're not just looking at how did we get here, what's contributing, but we're also trying to look at who are the people that are going to help survivors and victims and families get through these horrible events. So we're really trying to do a comprehensive look to understand how are things and how do they need to be. We're hoping that we can make some recommendations for some change at the end of our work to try to start having a better outcome for our folks. Number two, we're trying to understand the roles that federal, state, and tribal jurisdictions play. Number three, we're really trying to improve and implement a robust data collection and reporting method because that has skewed our numbers. So I'm a hopeful nature by person. I always want to try to end on a good note. So let me tell you at least some of the good news. There is a lot of historical healing and resilience that's happening. This is my cousin Ray Elaine's daughter, Elise. There she is, all grown up in her missing and murdered Indigenous persons hat, wearing her red jacket. Incidentally, we wear red because there's a belief that red is the one color that the spirits can still see when they cross over. So that's why red is such an important part of the MMIW movement. You'll often see advocates with a red hand on their face, and that's because those voices have been silenced, and we advocates are trying to speak on their behalf. So Elise came down. We froze our butts off in Appleton in February. The good folks of Esther in Appleton, it's an organization of churches that do great things for social justice causes. Boy, they have just took us under their wing, and they've really done a lot to try to help us raise awareness. So Elise is one of my fine examples of resilience. She grew up without her mother. Now, she'll tell you whenever she talks, she comes from a good family, and her grandparents and her dad and her aunties, everybody took really good care of her. But she has not been without her own pain and her own struggles. Through starting to do this work, initially I was kind of hoping she'd be on the task force, and at the time it was just too much. And she's like, no, can you do it? And my family said, why don't you do it? And the thing is, the closer you are to the situation, the harder that it is to talk about, right? I was in a meeting with one of my older cousins, and she did share a little bit, and this was just a couple years ago. And she said, it's the first time I've talked about this out loud. It's too painful to talk about. And what Elise has, and I don't begrudge anybody, right? It's really hard to go back and relive those days when Ray Elaine went missing. But what Elise has found is that by talking about this and by trying to do something about it, there's actually a lot of healing that takes place, as hard as it is. Ray Elaine and I did an interview for Wisconsin Public Radio. It was about 2 hours over Zoom during the pandemic. We were just wrung out at the end of it. But she and I have become good allies. I'm so proud of her. And she is doing some wonderful things to try to take care of herself, to try to break these cycles of abuse, and to try to make a difference. So she's just a little bright spot. So Ray Elaine was my mom's little ray of sunshine. Elise is my little ray of sunshine. I'm just so proud of her. And she's a beautiful, beautiful woman, just like her mom. She laughs just like her mom, too. That's why I picked this picture. That smile that you see there, that's an awful like how her mom smiles. So I've talked a lot about all these things, and I'd like to talk with you about ways that you can help. We really need allies to put pressure on our elected leaders to say, This is important. We have done enough damage to Native communities throughout our history. We need to start doing better for our Native tribes in our state. There are a number of grassroots human service organizations that serve survivors. They stand with families when their loved ones go missing. They run on shoestring budgets. So I'd like to tell you about a few of them. And if anybody's interested, I can send the email to Ann and I can get you some information. But up near Menominee, we have Woodland Women, Rachel Fernandez, who's an advocate. She gets groups of women and girls together to do learning about Native crafts and doing all that great stuff. When you get groups of women together, we get to be pretty powerful. And there's lots of good healing and sharing that happens when you're sitting around. I just went up a couple weeks ago for the first time and learned to make moccasins. So trying to reclaim what was lost. So Rachel's doing good work. There's an organization that I just love that Elise actually works for now, Waking Women Healing Institute. That is run by Kristen Welch. Kristen, like me, is a Menominee descendant, meaning we don't have quite enough blood to be enrolled, but we're very proud of our Menominee heritage, and we trying to do what we can to help. And her organization is wonderful. She does a lot of healing activities for women. She's a really fierce advocate. Kristen really, I feel like, was part of the backbone, along with Renee, to help build this task force. So those two groups are always looking for donations. In Oneida, we have Wise Women. They do a lot of wonderful things to support the tribal community and to give a safe space for women. Down in Milwaukee, an agency that I have just come to adore is called Her Wellness, and they serve, and it's HIR. I don't remember the acronym, but Jamie Kellicut is there, and I can tell you they do a lot of healing work for people that are surviving hard things and creating a platform and a place for people to heal. So we can use your advocacy on a political level. That would be great. And some of our organizations could really use help to continue this work, because a lot of folks trying to do this work, like I said, they're living in poor communities without a lot of resources. I think it sometimes depends on how well your casinos are doing as to how well tribes have resources truly to take care of their people. So I thank you for your time. I went a little bit over, but again, it always helps me when people show up and are interested. It makes me feel a little less alone, and it just gives me a lot more hope that we can change this. So thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you.
And let me just say, the woman on the left is Ray Elaine's mom, Josephine, who I just love. And this is Elisa's little son, Colton. So I don't have a recent picture of Barn or Pumpkin or Bernard, of Ray's dad, and I wish I did, because he's a dear man. So I want to say, really in closing, that I do this work for them. And I'll get choked up. So I do
Thank
this
you
for
very
my
much,
family.
Andrea.
Thanks.
I'm going to repeat the phone number for call-in questions from our remote viewers. It's 715-942-9917. And just a quick reminder that you may need to dial a 1 before that, 715-942-9917. Do we have any questions here in our studio audience?
Yes.
Is there some potential legislation that you see as most important to push through and get enacted?
I will get back to you on that. I do know that Renee and Kristen are still doing some behind-the-scenes work, and I don't know that I have all of the details. But what I would love to do, if I can let Winchester Academy know as those things come up where we need lobbying, I would love to get you that information in real time, and then you can help us out. Yeah, sorry, I don't know the answer to that.
Do we have any other questions or comments? Would you please use the microphone?
Does the tribe have healing services similar to what a social worker might do, but a tribal healing service for women who have been harmed so much?
Sure. There are lots of folks that are still practicing Native ceremonies, and there are healing ceremonies that happen, and they're different depending on the tribe. So yes, that is happening. Great question, and very important.
I'll just comment, Rick Kitchen commented on the Facebook site that the Religious Freedom Act was 1978.
Thank you, Rick. Oh, Rick is our great ally. He's friends with lots of Menominee, and he's at all of our meetings. He's constantly looking up stuff. Thank you, Rick. You're such a dear heart.
And you'll also send the things you mentioned that are looking for donations.
Yes.
The 4 things, you'll send that to Ann as well.
Yes, I certainly will. Thank you
so
so
she can
much.
Distribute that.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Any phone calls, Kate? Well,
No phone calls.
Here we have a question.
Thank you. I understood the jurisdiction issues, or one of the primary ones, has always been that Native police officers are not allowed to work off of the reservation. And there's been quite a bit of resistance towards that. However, I thought I heard something lately that there had been maybe a federal passage.
Yeah.
You know anything about that?
A little bit. This came up in our subcommittee meeting. I'm on the systems subcommittee, and we met on Friday as part of the task force. And so the Violence Against Women's Act was part of that big, is it the omnibus bill? That got passed. And now the Menominee attorney that I'm on this committee with is brilliant, and she's got a great mind, and she talks really fast, and she knows so much, and I can't keep up with her. But basically, this is my non-lawyer, understanding of that. Part of the Violence Against Women's Act, thanks to the Biden administration, has finally opened up and had kind of a monumental bit of legislation that could potentially open things up to fix some of these problems with these jurisdictional issues in Indian country. I don't understand the fine details, but what we were talking about in our committee are still those challenges. So if the federal government says, yes, you can start prosecuting your own crimes, they can also make demands about, you need these kind of computers, you need these kinds of licenses, you need to be able to hook up to this kind of database. And if you're a tribe that doesn't have a lot of resources, there still could be roadblocks. So it's exciting that at least a way maybe is being opened, but there are still these issues of funding and how do we make it happen. So yes, you did hear something. Actually, it passed so quietly. I remember we were talking about it, and I've been so busy at work, I haven't been paying attention, and I found out at the committee meeting that pretty exciting legislation has at least happened for the first time, and I think our tribal attorney said ever. I don't know if that's entirely true, but yes.
It's been around a while, hasn't it, the Violence Against Women Act?
It is, but there's something that was added specifically that could help us potentially start to chip away at some of these jurisdictional issues. That's my understanding of it. If I could phone a friend, I'd call Danica and ask her to explain it to you all.
Is there any data that categorizes the perpetrators of these crimes by ethnicity, age, education level, other kinds of crimes?
I would bet that exists. I just don't know. The Sovereign's Body Institute is a great place to go for gathering some data. But I don't know the answer to that. I'm sorry, Anne. Yeah.
I mean, it just occurred to me that, maybe the 2 men that your cousin was seen riding away with might have been known.
They were known to the people that were there. And my understanding is they were from the reservation. So in Ray's case, it wasn't, strangers driving through that picked her up. As far as we know, we don't know.
And she could have been fed into a ring or something, too.
We just don't know.
I read something historically, slides about 8, 9, 10-year-old young women being used sexually. And back in Europe, in yesteryear, it was so commonplace for husbands to have a woman on the side that sexual diseases were rampant. And one of the things, however they came up to believe this, was having sex with a young child, a young girl, would cure your sexual disease. So they were seeking that out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A quick question. Do you have a website? Is it MMIP? Can we go and find about legislation?
MMIW, yes. So if you go to the Department of Justice, the DOJ website, and search for MMIW, you'll find us. We meet quarterly, and those, except for the family sharing portion of the meeting, those are publicly broadcast. And yes, so you'd find more information there. Thanks.
Where do you meet?
Well, this is all taking place during the pandemic, so we meet on Zoom. I've met such wonderful people, and I haven't seen their beautiful faces in person because we've all been doing this virtually. So.
Well, I think we can wrap things up. Thank you so much, Andrea.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Okay. Yes.